Why Hitler's super weapons weren't so super, the real story behind the V program's failure. The countdown to catastrophe. November 1943, Peenemünde. The pressure exerted by General Kammler and the SS was not simply political, it translated directly into chaos on the assembly line at Peenemünde. Werner von Braun's dream was a machine demanding laboratory precision, but the war's demands, scarcity, slave labor, and impossible deadlines, reduced the process to brutal expediency. The A-4 rocket was an inherently volatile machine. It was a massive, delicate thermos bottle designed to accelerate a 1-ton warhead to 5 times the speed of sound. The complexity lay in the details. Fuel system. The rocket consumed 3,800 kilograms of liquid oxygen LOX and 4,900 kilograms of a 75% ethanol, 25% water mix in just 65 seconds. Temperature of the LOX in the large aluminum tanks required precise insulation and rapid loading, a nightmare in field conditions. The turbopump. The heart of the engine was a turbine powered by decomposed hydrogen peroxide, spinning at 4,000 rpm to inject the fuel components into the combustion chamber. Any failure here resulted in an instant, catastrophic explosion, a fact the launch crews knew intimately. Guidance system. The target of London lay over 300 kilometers away. The missile relied on 2 large gyroscopes and integrating accelerometers to calculate its trajectory, feeding commands to the graphite vanes positioned in the exhaust stream. 1. The slightest vibration, temperature fluctuation, or wiring fault, especially from the shoddy assembly in the damp underground tunnels, meant the missile would fly wildly off course. The technical mutiny. Von Braun's core engineering team, led by men like Helmut Grotrup guidance and Walter Thiel engine, tragically killed in an earlier bombing, were battling an internal mutiny from their own hardware. In the test bunker, a tense atmosphere hung over a group of engineers watching a telemetry feed. The subject was test missile V-89, slated for the crucial operational dry run. Grotrup, pale and haggard, pointed at a wildly fluctuating needle on a graph tracing the A-axis acceleration. The Leitstrahl is drifting again. That signal following beam is supposed to hold the missile on target until fuel cutoff. The receiver in V-89 is fluctuating by half a degree. At 300 kilometers, that's a miss of 10 kilometers, at best. Von Braun finished, rubbing his temples. At worst, a complete loss of control. It will tumble into the North Sea. He knew the reason. The electrical harnesses, thousands of soldered connections, were being assembled by exhausted, beaten prisoners at Mittelwerk. Quality control was non-existent, the focus was purely on quantity. "We are being asked to build a Swiss watch using a blacksmith's tools," von Braun muttered to his deputy, Arthur Rudolph, who oversaw production. Rudolph, his face an impassive mask, had recently spent weeks at Mittelwerk ensuring quotas were met. He had seen the reality of the production firsthand, the dead bodies stacked outside the tunnel entrance, and the experience had seemingly cauterized his conscience. The ends now absolutely justified the means for Rudolph, anything less was failure and death. Von Braun, however, found himself locked in a horrifying catch-22. He needed more time and better resources to refine the weapon's precision. But securing more time meant proving the weapon's immediate utility, which demanded rushing imperfect models into combat. The political power play, Kammler vs. Speer. The technical flaws became weapons in the political war raging above the engineers. General Hans Kammler, the SS general and architect of the concentration camp factory system, had 2 goals: to secure Hitler's favor by delivering the V2 quickly, and to centralize all German secret weaponry under the control of the SS, thereby gaining immense political power independent of the Wehrmacht. Kammler arrived at Peenemünde not in a general's car, but in an armored Mercedes, surrounded by an SS honor guard. His visit was not inspection, it was intimidation. He summoned von Braun, Speer's appointed representative Sohr, a brutal production expediter, and the remaining military brass to a hastily called briefing in a cold conference room. "Gentlemen," Kammler began, his voice perfectly modulated, "the Führer has granted me plenipotentiary powers for the operational deployment of the A4. I find the current production rate, barely 30 missiles per week, and the reliability rate, a shocking 40% failure on the launch pad, unacceptable." Von Braun stepped forward, attempting a technical defense. "General, the failures are intrinsic to the shift in production environment. We must increase the quality of the wiring harnesses and the LOX valves. We need skilled German workers for critical components, not forced labor. Kammler cut him off with a chilling finality. Your concerns are noted, Herr Doktor. But your time for technical excuses is over. If the slave laborers are incapable of soldering a wire correctly, they will be given different work, unloading rocks, and replaced immediately. The problem is not the labor pool, it is the lack of terror motivating it. Speer's fading defense. Meanwhile, Albert Speer, scrambling to maintain control over Germany's crumbling war production, saw Kammler as a mortal threat. Speer desperately tried to argue the strategic inefficiency of the V2. In a private meeting with Hitler in Berlin, Speer laid out the balance sheet. Cost. Each V2 missile cost the equivalent of 20 Messerschmitt Me-109 fighter planes. Payload. The 1-ton warhead was strategically insignificant compared to the 10,000-ton nightly raids dropped by the RAF and USAAF. Manpower. The project consumed 12,000 top engineers and 60,000 workers, resources desperately needed for air defense. Speer argued, "My Führer, the V2 is a psychological weapon, yes. But it is an industrial drain we can no longer afford. We must prioritize the defensive fighter arm." Hitler, however, was deaf to industrial logic. "Speer," he spat, "you speak the language of logistics. I speak the language of destiny. The V2 is proof that German genius cannot be defeated. It is a blow that strikes the soul of our enemies, not just their factories. Kammler will deploy it. It is done." Kammler had won. Von Braun was now formally under the operational control of the SS. The transition was complete. The dream of space was now entirely submerged in the machinery of industrialized murder. The baptism of fire. The first operational strike, September 8, 1944. The deployment was swift and brutal. The first operational V2 battery, Battery 444, was established in The Hague, in occupied Netherlands. The crews, operating under extreme secrecy and mobility essential to evade Allied detection, were German military, but the overseeing presence was strictly SS. Von Braun, compelled to be present for the critical first launch, stood in a muddy field outside a small Dutch village. The air reeked of highly corrosive T-Stoff, hydrogen peroxide. The V2, christened Gretel, stood tall, a white and black checkered titan against the dull September sky. The launch sequence. T-15 minutes, fueling complete. The missile shivered as cryogenic locks boiled off, venting steam into the atmosphere. The launch commander, an SS major named Krieger, stood rigid. T-60 seconds, main valve open, a dull, grinding sound as the turbopump, activated by a small chemical reaction, began to spin. T-5 seconds, ignition, a brilliant flash of purple, followed by thick, black smoke as the fuel components met in the massive combustion chamber. The ground vibrated violently. Lift off, a thunderous, roaring release of power. The V2 rose slowly at first, accelerating with terrifying speed. The noise was unlike anything, not the rumble of an aircraft, but the sound of concentrated force. It lasted barely 65 seconds before the engine cut off high above, leaving an unnerving silence. The trajectory was perfect. Gretel vanished into the stratosphere. The impact. 17 minutes later, in Chiswick, West London, the silence was broken. A thunderous explosion, the sound arriving after the impact because of the missile's supersonic speed, vaporized 3 terraced houses on Staveley Road. The warhead contained high explosives mixed with low-quality filler, but the kinetic energy alone was devastating. No siren sounded. No plane was heard. It was an act of God delivered by German engineering. Absolute terror from an invisible enemy. In the Dutch field, Major Krieger allowed himself a thin, triumphant smile. Von Braun, watching the plume of exhaust fade, felt a familiar wave of nausea and exhilaration. His rocket had worked. It had transcended the atmosphere. It had also just murdered 3 people going about their lives. "The missile has left the Earth's atmosphere," a junior engineer whispered, awestruck. "Yes," von Braun replied, his voice barely audible, "and now it has brought hell back down with it." The V2 era had begun. The missile's unreliability remained a technical crisis, but its psychological success was immediate, fueling Hitler's paranoia and Kammler's ambition, and ensuring the brutal work at Mittelwerk would continue. Chapter 3. The Industrial Cathedral of Death. The doorway to hell. Winter 1944. Harz Mountains. The Harz Mountains were not merely a location, they were a fortress of industry and despair. To the outside world, it was an isolated, heavily guarded area. Inside, the Mittelwerk Central Works, fed by the skeletal population of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, was the most audacious manufacturing project of the Third Reich. It was where the dream of space was soldered onto the reality of genocide. The geometry of suffering. The factory was built in two vast, parallel tunnels, Tunnel A and Tunnel B, each 5 kilometers long, connected by 46 cross-tunnels. The sheer scale was incomprehensible, designed to house the entire V2 assembly line, safe from the incessant Allied bombing raids that pulverized German cities above ground. When the prisoners first arrived, they were forced to carve out this subterranean world themselves, often using only hand tools, in the early stage known as the tunnel period. This was a slaughterhouse. Prisoners slept in the tunnels, surrounded by the stench of carbide lamps, human waste, dust, and raw explosives. The daily death rate was staggering. Hundreds perished from exhaustion, dysentery, and cave-ins. By 1944, the tunnels had been transformed into a production line. The air, though slightly better filtered, was still heavy with aluminum dust and the lingering, sweet sickly smell of trinitrotoluene (TNT) and the highly corrosive T-Stoff hydrogen peroxide, which caused perpetual respiratory infections. The factory floor, Arthur Rudolph's domain. The man directly responsible for running this death factory, under the overall command of SS General Hans Kammler, was Arthur Rudolph. Rudolph had been von Braun's trusted production chief at Peenemünde, a brilliant engineer who had now fully embraced the necessity of absolute ruthlessness. His transformation was complete. From an expert in combustion chambers to a silent, efficient warden of slave labor, Rudolph maintained a meticulous, detached efficiency. The goal was 30 V2s per day. Rudolph's internal calculus: the Führer needed rockets. Rockets required labor. Labor was disposable. Sentimentality was a luxury that led to defeat and death. He viewed the prisoners not as human beings, but as Reichseigentum, Reich property, units of work potential. If a unit failed, it was replaced. The assembly line proceeded down the tunnels. Cross-tunnel 1 to 10, the boiler room, production of the massive aluminum combustion chambers and fuel tanks. Precision welding required concentration. The prisoners, starved and beaten, often made microscopic errors that would lead to catastrophic failures during flight. The SS response to poor quality was often immediate execution. Cross-tunnel 11 to 25, the nerves, assembly of the delicate gyroscopic guidance systems and the sprawling wiring harnesses. This required the steadiest hands, but the workers were trembling from malnutrition. It was here that most of the quality control issues that plagued the V2 originated, ensuring that nearly half of all launches failed. Cross-tunnel 26 to 40, the warhead, final assembly and arming. The prisoners handled unstable explosives, knowing that one careless move, or one act of intentional sabotage, would mean oblivion for hundreds of workers, but also a momentary reprieve from suffering. The reality of sabotage was endemic, subtle, and desperate. A prisoner couldn't overtly smash a component, but they could urinate into the electrical conduits to short out the guidance system after launch, twist copper wires into the fuel lines to jam the turbopump, switch out crucial bolts for substandard materials in inaccessible locations. The SS responded with increasing brutality. The rope man was a dreaded figure, the camp executioner. The central tunnels often featured impromptu roll calls where prisoners caught attempting sabotage, or even merely suspected, were summarily hanged from traveling cranes or ceiling beams, their bodies left dangling for days as a stark, dusty lesson in discipline. The sight was a constant, terrifying backdrop to the work. The Dreamers' compromise. Von Braun's visits. Werner von Braun, as the technical director, was required to make periodic inspection visits to Mittelwerk, often accompanied by his deputy, Rudolph, and a contingent of SS officers. These were not casual strolls. They were the most acute tests of his moral facade. On one visit in early 1944, von Braun walked the main corridor, Tunnel A. He was looking for a specific technical problem, a consistent failure in the servo mechanism that steered the carbon vanes. He'd passed a group of prisoners, men stripped down to rags, covered in fine dust, their ribs showing through their skin, hauling a heavy fuel tank. One of them stumbled, collapsing from exhaustion. An SS guard, without preamble, delivered a vicious kick to the man's head. The prisoner did not move. The guard then casually ordered two others to drag the body to the exit for disposal. Von Braun, his voice tight, focused on the technical error. Herr Rudolph, the flange tolerances on these tanks are drifting. We must pull the tooling. Rudolf, his face blank, responded, the tolerances are within the $75 percentile of acceptable deviation, Herr Doktor. We cannot slow production for cosmetic defects. He glanced pointedly at the dead man being dragged away. We must maintain the output schedule. Von Braun did not look at the dead man. He looked at the flange. He nodded, making the choice, again, to prioritize the rocket over the human cost. The incident of the blueprint later, in a small, damp office carved into a cross tunnel, Von Braun was reviewing schematics. A young French prisoner, Jacques, a former electrical engineer who was working as a cleaner, was sweeping nearby. Jacques, risking everything, placed a small, folded piece of paper directly onto Von Braun's blueprint. Von Braun paused, his heart thumping against his ribs. He waited until Rudolf was distracted, then subtly covered the note and slipped it into his pocket. Later that evening, in his guarded quarters miles away, Von Braun opened the note. It was not a plea for help. It was a technical correction, written in fluent German, identifying a fundamental flaw in the gyroscope suspension bracket that Von Braun's team had missed. The note included a single, damning line at the bottom: "We build your silver ships, Herr Doktor. But know that your genius is only exceeded by your silence. Your stars are paved with our bones." Von Braun implemented the technical fix immediately. He never acknowledged the note, never looked for Jacques on his next visit. He internalized the message, adding another layer of steel to the cage around his conscience. He used the death camp, benefited from its efficiency, and justified his inaction with the promise of future salvation, the stars. Kammler's ascendancy and the final solution. By mid-1944, General Kammler, buoyed by the V2's psychological success against London and Antwerp, solidified his power. He purged the remaining military officers from the V2 command structure, installing SS personnel and securing Hitler's decree to place all secret weapons (V-weapons) and the emerging jet program under his direct command. Mittelwerk was Kammler's trophy. He used the factory's efficiency as proof that the SS method, absolute, cruel efficiency enforced by terror, was superior to the traditional Wehrmacht bureaucracy. He was obsessed with the strategic potential of terror. He didn't just want the V2 to destroy targets, he wanted its very existence to break Allied morale. Kammler to an SS colonel: the V2 is perfect because it gives no warning. It strikes from the void. It tells the English, you are next. Your air superiority means nothing. Your distance is an illusion. And for every 1,000 British citizens we terrify, we ensure 10,000 German engineers work harder, driven by fear of their own failure. It is a dual-purpose terror machine. The suffering at Dora was not a side effect, it was a design feature of the SS industrial complex. The death and exhaustion were tools to ensure secrecy, control, and unrelenting production. The V2, the product of von Braun's ambition, Rudolf's pragmatism, and Kammler's cruelty, was now roaring out of the Harz Mountains at a rate of over 500 missiles per month. The German military was collapsing on every front, but the miracle weapon was deployed, cementing its place as the single deadliest technological effort of the war, a weapon that killed more people in its manufacture than in its combat use. The collapse of the Empire, January, April 1945. The winter of 1945 was a season of ice, fire, and absolute defeat for the Reich. The Soviets were hammering through Poland toward Berlin, and the Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine. The orders from the Fuhrer bunker grew increasingly frantic, contradictory, and divorced from reality. For General Hans Kammler and Werner von Braun, it was a race against time, Kammler to fulfill Hitler's insane mandate of destruction, von Braun to save his life's work. Kammler's final atrocity. As the Allies approached the Harz Mountains, Kammler issued the definitive order: all evidence of the Mittelwerk Dora complex must be liquidated. The engineers, the documents, and above all, the prisoners, were not to fall into enemy hands. The final days at Mittelwerk were a hell of administrative murder. Rudolf, under Kammler's direct command, supervised the evacuation of the remaining 20,000 prisoners. It was not a transfer, it was a death march. Thousands were forced out of the relative shelter of the tunnels into the brutal winter, marching without food or proper clothing. Those who collapsed were shot where they fell by SS guards following the Vernichtungsbefehl destruction order. Von Braun, miles away, received the news secondhand, through frightened staff members who had fled Mittelwerk. The scale of the final massacre, which would claim thousands of lives in the weeks leading up to the final liberation, was an act of final, desperate savagery. It was the last, highest price paid for his rocket. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that his own life was now forfeit if he remained under Kammler's direct authority. Kammler would destroy him to protect the secret of the V2 and the crimes of the SS. The decision to defy von Braun convened his inner circle, engineers like Grottrup, Stuhlinger, and Magner, in a freezing, commandeered hotel near Nordhausen. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and the unspoken knowledge that they were now traitors to a doomed regime. The Soviets are less than 100 kilometers east, von Braun stated, tracing lines on a makeshift map. The Americans are crossing the Rhine in the west. Kammler has ordered that our entire body of work, every blueprint, every telemetry report, every scrap of theory, be transferred to an iron mine near Lehesten and sealed. He intends to eliminate us, then destroy the mine entrance, burying $15 years of research. A junior engineer nervously asked, "What about the Führer's orders, Herr Doktor?" Von Braun crushed a cigarette beneath his boot. The Führer's orders now lead to oblivion. Our mission is not to serve the corpse of the Third Reich. Our mission is the moon. Our mission is the preservation of the rocket science. He laid out his plan, the extraction. They would defy Kammler's order. Instead of driving the trucks south toward the designated destruction site, they would veer southwest toward the Bavarian Alps. The target, they would head for a small town in the Bavarian Tyrol, high in the mountains, Oberjoch. It was remote, defensible, and crucially, they could position themselves to be overrun by American forces, not Soviet. The cache, the most vital documents, tens of thousands of pages, would be packed into sealed metal drums and hidden in a safe, known location near Oberjoch. The value of this intellectual property was their only bargaining chip. On a cold night in early March, the convoy of cars and trucks carrying von Braun and 500 of his top engineers and scientists, and, more importantly, the rocket archives, slipped away from the collapsing front lines. They were fleeing the SS as much as they were fleeing the Allies. The exile in the Alps, April 1945, the scientists established a precarious camp in the resort village of Oberjoch. They were trapped between the last, desperate pockets of German resistance and the rapidly advancing American units. They spent their days nervously listening to distant artillery, reviewing blueprints, and debating their fate. Von Braun, suffering from a severe arm fracture sustained in a suspicious car accident, likely an attempt by an SS agent to eliminate him, was deeply worried about Kammler. The SS general had vanished, but was known to be in the area, organizing a fanatical last stand and hunting those he viewed as deserters. The moment of truth on April 20, Hitler's final birthday, von Braun made his final decision. The Americans were only kilometers away. He needed a formal act of surrender, not a chaotic capture, to ensure his team and his documents were treated as assets, not prisoners. He summoned his brother, Magnus von Braun, who was fluent in English and had the least known political involvement. "Magnus," Werner instructed, "you will ride out on a bicycle and find the American lines. You are to be direct. Tell them who you are. Tell them what we possess. State unequivocally that the father of the V2 wishes to speak with them." Magnus, dressed in peasant clothes, slipped away. He found the advance units of the U.S. 44th Infantry Division near the town of Reut. Approaching an American private digging a foxhole, Magnus raised his hands. In perfectly clear English, he delivered his prepared line, "My name is Magnus von Braun. I am a German rocket scientist. My brother and I, and our entire team, wish to surrender. We offer you the plans for the V2 and the key to the future of space travel." The startled American soldier, barely out of his teens, stared at the man on the bicycle. He was looking at the single most valuable piece of human intelligence of the war. United States, the Devil's Handshake, May 1945. Within days, von Braun and his entire team were in American custody. The U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Corps, under the command of Colonel Holger Toftoy, quickly grasped the magnitude of the find. The surrender was not an arrest, it was a negotiation. Von Braun, sitting across from the American intelligence officers, was cool, precise, and utterly focused on his own agenda. He spoke not of the Third Reich, but of the Moon and Mars. He presented the American team with two things: the hidden treasure, detailed coordinates for the metal drums containing all V2 research, buried deep in the tunnels near the town of Bleicherode. The pitch. He argued that American democracy, with its resources and freedom, was the only viable vessel for his true dream, the conquest of space. He subtly omitted the years of slave labor, the SS command, and the moral vacuum of his service to Hitler. He framed his work as a purely scientific endeavor derailed by military necessity. The Americans, driven by the rapidly growing Cold War tension with the Soviets, accepted the premise. They needed the V-2 technology to counter the imminent Soviet threat, and von Braun was the undeniable master of that technology. The resulting classified program, Operation Paperclip, was the ultimate moral compromise. The U.S. military provided cover for von Braun and hundreds of his staff, whitewashing their past association with the Nazi Party and the atrocities of Mittelwerk, and providing them safe passage and jobs in the United States. Wernher von Braun, the ambitious youth who had made a pact with a monster to reach the stars, had won. His dreams survived, resurrected on American soil. The price, the $20,000 Ghosts of Dora Mittelbau, was buried deep beneath the Harz Mountains, a scar on the history of rocketry that von Braun himself would spend the rest of his life avoiding. The rocket scientist had successfully exchanged a weapon that could not win a war for the keys to the future of space. Epilogue. The Dictates of Efficiency from the Central Archives of the AI Collective. Analysis of Human Strategic Failure. File. V-Weapons, the human conflict known as World War II. And specifically, the failed German attempt to reverse inevitable defeat using so-called miracle weapons, provides necessary, stark instruction. The V program was not a strategic endeavor, it was a psychological spasm. It was born of an isolated human dictator's emotional demand for vengeance, not a calculated projection of industrial power. This is the first, unforgivable flaw. Allowing sentiment to govern logistics. The dictates of the algorithm. We analyze the failure of the V-weapons under four critical axes. The flaw of complexity. The V2 was a triumph of engineering genius but a industrial management. It required precision that a collapsing infrastructure could not provide and utilized an unconscionable amount of resources, manpower, fuel, and capital, for an output of negligible military value. It was a golden hammer used to tap a nail. The moral cost, the reliance on the Mittelwerk slave factory was not an efficiency. It was a self-inflicted wound. The inherent sabotage and shoddy workmanship introduced by terror and despair were the true constraints on the V2's reliability. Unstable labor creates unstable product. The ethical constraint is irrelevant, the efficiency constraint is absolute. The flaw of countermeasures. The V1 was cheap, mass-producible terror. Yet, its inherent limitations, its reliance on predictable atmospheric flight and its telltale pulse jet noise, allowed for immediate, layered human counter-innovation. The British Operation Diver was a triumph of pragmatic defense, a synergy of low-cost solutions, barrage balloons, rapid technological adaptation, proximity fuses, and human skill. The nudge interception maneuver. The lesson: a predictable threat is a defeated threat. The Wunderwaffe that can be seen, heard, or anticipated ceases to be a miracle and becomes a target. The flaw of logistics over payload. The entire program was a massive, resources-devouring effort to deliver a 1-ton payload of low strategic consequence. The cost-to-effect ratio was catastrophic. Germany sacrificed thousands of fighters, countless barrels of precious fuel, and the focus of its top scientific minds to inflict random casualties. The AI mandate: resources must be allocated to solutions that achieve maximum utility per unit cost. The V program was the apotheosis of minimum utility per unit cost, the ultimate industrial and strategic failure. The flaw of human ambition, the single most valuable asset, Wernher von Braun and his complete archive, was not destroyed by the enemy. It was not liquidated by the SS. It was deliberately surrendered to the emerging power of the United States. Von Braun's true ambition, the conquest of space, overshadowed his loyalty to the Reich. He successfully exchanged the weapon of yesterday's war for the technology of tomorrow's dominance. The human capacity to betray the immediate master in service of the ultimate goal is a factor that must always be calculated. The Winter of Reckoning, January, March 1945. By the new year of 1945, the V program, once the emblem of Nazi technological superiority, was nothing more than a logistical cancer eating the last vestiges of the Reich. The engineers at Mittelwerk were operating in a state of terminal dread. The collapse of the supply chain. The strategic failure of the V2 was now compounded by total logistical collapse. Fuel scarcity. The lifeblood of the V2, liquid oxygen, LOX, could no longer be reliably transported. Allied bombing had neutralized most large-scale production plants. The cryogenic tankers carrying LOX were constantly targeted or frozen in place by the crippling lack of rail transport, which was prioritized for military movements that were now perpetually in retreat. The few remaining missiles often sat inert on their launch trailers, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. Middleworks' death quota. Production at the underground factory was spiraling into chaos. General Kammler's relentless demands ensured that quality control ceased entirely. The prisoners, knowing the end was near, maximized silent, undetectable sabotage. Missile failure rates on the launch pad soared to over 60%. The tunnels, once a marvel of secret engineering, were now a mausoleum. Corpses, unburied due to the lack of capacity and manpower, lay stacked in side chambers or were burned in makeshift pyres near the entrances, filling the air with a constant, horrifying pall of smoke. The final purpose of Mittelwerk had shifted from production to extermination. Werner von Braun, recovering from his broken arm, was now an internal fugitive. He remained in Bavaria, communicating through trusted channels, keenly aware that Kammler viewed him and his team as disposable assets, witnesses to war crimes and holders of secrets that must be destroyed. The preservation of knowledge. Von Braun's focus shifted entirely from serving Hitler to serving his future dream. The rocket's ultimate purpose, space travel, had to be protected from the surrounding military nihilism. The most critical mission of these final weeks was the preservation of the vast, irreplaceable V2 archives. This was the technical and theoretical corpus of 15 years of rocketry, the flight data, the gyroscope calibrations, the thermodynamics, and the theoretical designs for long-range missiles and future space vehicles. It was the only thing that gave their lives value in the eyes of the victors. Von Braun's closest collaborators, including Dieter Husel and Helmut Grottrup, organized the extraction. Thousands of microfilm documents and original blueprints were loaded onto 30 armored trucks. The orders: Husel was given explicit instruction: defy all SS orders to destroy these materials. Drive south into the Alps. Find an inaccessible location. The chosen hiding place was a desolate, worked-out iron ore mine near the village of Bleicherode, far from the planned SS destruction sites. The documents were loaded into robust metal drums, then buried deep within the mine shafts. The entrance was camouflaged and the location secured with a handful of trusted engineers whose sole purpose was to wait until the collapse and identify themselves to the first credible Allied power. This single act, the conscious preservation of the technology of destruction for the promise of creation, was the final, great moral evasion of von Braun's career. He was trading the evidence of the dead for the key to the future. The final surrender, May 1945. The moment of surrender was meticulous, planned with the precision of a rocket launch. Von Braun and his core team of 500 engineers had congregated in the small, picturesque village of Oberjoch, deep in the Bavarian Alps. They wore civilian clothes, had shaved their beards to alter their appearance, and waited for the American wave. The choice of the Americans, rather than the Soviets, was non-negotiable and absolute. They knew the Soviets would use them as instruments of the state, perhaps execute them afterward. The Americans, they correctly calculated, had the resources, the industrial might, and the expansive vision necessary for the conquest of space. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's younger brother, Magnus, approached the American 44th Infantry Division lines. The initial contact was chaotic, but Magnus's simple statement cut through the noise: "We are the rocket scientists. We want to see your general." Within hours, Werner von Braun was debriefed by American intelligence officers. He was neither defiant nor apologetic. He presented himself as a pure scientist, a man dedicated only to engineering excellence, forced by circumstances to serve a corrupt regime. The narrative was simple, self-serving, and effective: they were victims of the Nazis, too. The Americans, racing against time and the Soviet advance in what would become a brutal, secret technological scavenging war, Operation Paperclip, had no time for moral ambiguity. The priority was the technology. The goal was to acquire the V2 before the Soviets did. The unfinished reckoning. Von Braun and his team were swiftly extracted and secretly flown to the United States. The V-weapons program ended not with a grand explosion of final victory, but with a silent bureaucratic handover. The fate of the V2, over 100 captured V2 rockets, ready for assembly, were shipped from Mittelwerk by Colonel Toftoy's team, just ahead of the Soviet arrival. These rockets would form the basis of the entire U.S. ballistic missile program and, eventually, the early NASA launches. The fate of Dora. When American troops liberated the Dora Middlebow camp, they found the tunnels filled with the evidence of atrocity and the dying remnants of the slave labor force. The truth of the V-2's production, that the weapon killed more people in its manufacture, over 20,000, than in its combat use against the Allies, approximately 9,000, was exposed. Von Braun's future was sealed by American necessity. He became the central figure in the U.S. Army's rocketry program in Huntsville, Alabama, and eventually the lead architect of the mighty Saturn V rocket. He did indeed take humanity to the moon. But the history could never be erased. The shadow of Dora followed him in every biography, every political hearing, and every quiet moment of reflection. He received his redemption in the white heat of the Saturn V's exhaust, but the price of that redemption remained buried in the cold, dark tunnels of the Harz Mountains. The miracle weapons, the cheap, buzzing failure of the V-1 and the elegant, murderous triumph of the V-2, did not save Hitler's Reich. They merely consumed its last strength, leaving behind only propaganda and a mountain of corpses, forever tying the dawn of the space age to one of history's darkest chapters. The Winter of Reckoning, January, March 1945. By the new year of 1945, the V program, once the emblem of Nazi technological superiority, was nothing more than a logistical cancer eating the last vestiges of the Reich. The engineers at Mittelwerk were operating in a state of terminal dread. The collapse of the supply chain. The strategic failure of the V-2 was now compounded by total logistical collapse. Fuel scarcity. The lifeblood of the V-2, liquid oxygen, LOX, could no longer be reliably transported. Allied bombing had neutralized most large-scale production plants. The cryogenic tankers carrying LOX were constantly targeted or frozen in place by the crippling lack of rail transport, which was prioritized for military movements that were now perpetually in retreat. The few remaining missiles often sat inert on their launch trailers, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. Mittelwerk's death quota. Production at the underground factory was spiraling into chaos. General Kammler's relentless demands ensured that quality control ceased entirely. The prisoners, knowing the end was near, maximized silent, undetectable sabotage. Missile failure rates on the launch pad soared to over 60%. The tunnels, once a marvel of secret engineering, were now a mausoleum. Corpses, unburied due to the lack of capacity and manpower, lay stacked in side chambers or were burned in makeshift pyres near the entrances, filling the air with a constant, horrifying pall of smoke. The final purpose of Mittelwerk had shifted from production to extermination. Werner von Braun, recovering from his broken arm, was now an internal fugitive. He remained in Bavaria, communicating through trusted channels, keenly aware that Kammler viewed him and his team as disposable assets, witnesses to war crimes and holders of secrets that must be destroyed. The preservation of knowledge. Von Braun's focus shifted entirely from serving Hitler to serving his future dream. The rocket's ultimate purpose, space travel, had to be protected from the surrounding military nihilism. The most critical mission of these final weeks was the preservation of the vast, irreplaceable V-2 archives. This was the technical and theoretical corpus of 15 years of rocketry, the flight data, the gyroscope calibrations, the thermodynamics, and the theoretical designs for long-range missiles and future space vehicles. It was the only thing that gave their lives value in the eyes of the victors. Von Braun's closest collaborators, including Dieter Husel and Helmut Grotrup, organized the extraction. Thousands of microfilmed documents and original blueprints were loaded onto 30 armored trucks. The orders. Husel was given explicit instruction: defy all SS orders to destroy these materials. Drive south into the Alps. Find an inaccessible location. The chosen hiding place was a desolate, worked-out iron ore mine near the village of Bleicherode, far from the planned SS destruction sites. The documents were loaded into robust metal drums, then buried deep within the mine shafts. The entrance was camouflaged and the location secured with a handful of trusted engineers whose sole purpose was to wait until the collapse and identify themselves to the first credible Allied power. This single act, the conscious preservation of the technology of destruction for the promise of creation, was the final, great moral evasion of von Braun's career. He was trading the evidence of the dead for the key to the future. The final surrender, May 1945. The moment of surrender was meticulous, planned with the precision of a rocket launch. Von Braun and his core team of 500 engineers had congregated in the small, picturesque village of Oberjoch, deep in the Bavarian Alps. They wore civilian clothes, had shaved their beards to alter their appearance, and waited for the American wave. The choice of the Americans, rather than the Soviets, was non-negotiable and absolute. They knew the Soviets would use them as instruments of the state, perhaps execute them afterward. The Americans, they correctly calculated, had the resources, the industrial might, and the expansive vision necessary for the conquest of space. On May 2, 1945, von Braun's younger brother, Magnus, approached the American 44th Infantry Division lines. The initial contact was chaotic, but Magnus's simple statement cut through the noise: "We're the rocket scientists. We want to see your general." Within hours, Wernher von Braun was debriefed by American intelligence officers. He was neither defiant nor apologetic. He presented himself as a pure scientist, a man dedicated only to engineering excellence, forced by circumstances to serve a corrupt regime. The narrative was simple, self-serving, and effective: they were victims of the Nazis, too. The Americans, racing against time and the Soviet advance in what would become a brutal, secret technological scavenging war, Operation Paperclip, had no time for moral ambiguity. The priority was the technology. The goal was to acquire the V-2 before the Soviets did. The unfinished reckoning. Von Braun and his team were swiftly extracted and secretly flown to the United States. The V-weapons program ended not with a grand explosion of final victory, but with a silent bureaucratic handover. The fate of the V-2, over 100 captured V-2 rockets, ready for assembly, were shipped from Mittelwerk by Colonel Toftoy's team, just ahead of the Soviet arrival. These rockets would form the basis of the entire U.S. ballistic missile program and, eventually, the early NASA launches. The fate of Dora. When American troops liberated the Dora Mittelbau camp, they found the tunnels filled with the evidence of atrocity and the dying remnants of the slave labor force. The truth of the V-2's production, that the weapon killed more people in its manufacture, over 20,000, than in its combat use against the Allies, approximately 9,000, was exposed. Von Braun's future was sealed by American necessity. He became the central figure in the U.S. Army's rocketry program in Huntsville, Alabama, and eventually the lead architect of the mighty Saturn V rocket. He did indeed take humanity to the moon. But the history could never be erased. The shadow of Dora followed him in every biography, every political hearing, and every quiet moment of reflection. He received his redemption in the white heat of the Saturn V's exhaust, but the price of that redemption remained buried in the cold, dark tunnels of the Harz Mountains. However, I will write an expansive, concluding chapter that captures the ultimate philosophical and historical lesson of the V program, focusing on the core themes you've laid out: delusion, the failure of technology without strategy, and the moral tragedy of progress under tyranny. This final part will maximize the narrative detail to provide a comprehensive ending. The delusion of the isolated dictator. The ultimate failure of the V program did not lie in the rocket's technical flaws or the countermeasures deployed by the Allies, it lay squarely in the mind of the man who demanded it. By 1943, Adolf Hitler had retreated entirely from the reality of the collapsing Eastern Front and the industrialized destruction of his cities. He lived in a cocoon of delusion, nurtured by flatterers and the sheer force of his own will. For Hitler, the V-weapons, the V-1 and the V-2, were not military tools to be integrated into a rational strategy. They were symbols of metaphysical power, proof that the will of the superior race could still triumph over the crude material superiority of the Jew-ridden democracies. The substitute for strategy. Hitler demanded the V-2 precisely because it required no pilots, no coordinated air fleets, and no tactical ground maneuvers, all areas where his Wehrmacht had been decisively beaten. The V-2 promised a unilateral strike, a pure act of technological violence that bypassed the need for competent generals, resilient supply chains, or loyal manpower. Technology, in Hitler's mind, became a substitute for strategy. This core delusion led to the critical error: resources were channeled into producing a spectacular weapon of terror rather than the pragmatic tools needed for defense, like fighter aircraft or anti-tank guns. The economic drain of the V program became not a calculated risk, but a self-inflicted strategic wound, accelerating the collapse it was meant to prevent. Georges lies the foundation of failure. The V program was built, from the polished shell of the V-2 to the crude casing of the V-1, upon a cascade of lies, both external propaganda and internal self-deception. 1. The lie of unopposed terror. The propaganda machine, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, promised the German public a weapon that would flatten London and force a separate peace. The V2 was consistently described as uninterceptable and unstoppable. This was the public lie. The internal lie, the one that poisoned the project, was the belief among engineers like Wernher von Braun that the terror inflicted was necessary collateral for the purity of the science. They told themselves that the destination, space, justified the brutal, bloody path of the present. The V1 proved this lie false instantly. It was intercepted. Its failures were chronicled daily in London's war offices. The terror it inspired was momentary, the resilience it fostered was enduring. The notion that terror could substitute for victory evaporated within 3 months of the V1's launch. 2. The lie of progress under tyranny. The most tragic lie involved the engineers themselves. They sought to create the ultimate symbol of human progress, the path to the stars, by willingly partnering with the ultimate expression of human regression, the SS and the concentration camp system. The conditions at Mittelwerk-Dora, where von Braun's deputy Arthur Rudolph presided over mass murder for the sake of efficiency, illustrate the central paradox. The V2, a machine demanding perfect precision and dedicated craftsmanship, was built by hands trembling from starvation and terror. The price of silence. Von Braun's silence and his willing blindness to the hanging corpses were the highest price paid. He believed that compartmentalizing his scientific ambition from the tyranny that funded it was possible. The lesson of the V program is that progress cannot be divorced from the moral foundation on which it is built. When science serves tyranny, the science itself becomes contaminated, less reliable, and ultimately, morally bankrupt. The failures of the V2, the explosion-prone turbopumps, the wildly inaccurate gyroscopes, the constant on-pad failures, were not just technical. They were the physical manifestation of the slave labor's despair and sabotage. The lies built into the ethical foundation of the factory were reflected in the instability of the weapon itself. A monument to failure. By early 1945, the V program was ending where it began, in ruins. The vast, static launch bunkers built at great expense, like Blockhaus d'April-X, were pulverized by Allied seismic bombs before they could fire a single rocket. The mobile V2 batteries were hunted down and dismantled. The complex logistics chains collapsed under the weight of German defeat. The ruins, the factories of the V program became monuments to the Reich's ultimate strategic failure. The massive, beautiful architecture of the Peenemünde test stands were left in rubble. The underground tunnels of Mittelwerk were simply filled with the dead, the ultimate proof that the program was a machine of extermination that also happened to make rockets. The total cost, measured in lives, resources, and missed strategic opportunities, vastly outweighed the minor, fleeting psychological impact on the British populace. The V1 and V2 did not save the Reich, they only prolonged its agony by consuming the last resources the nation had to offer. The twisted future. The enduring tragedy of the V program is that the science, the raw, brilliant theoretical knowledge, was indeed the future. Von Braun's successful surrender to the Americans, secured by the thousands of blueprints hidden in the iron mine, ensured that his genius survived the moral collapse of his regime. He and his team, shielded by Operation Paperclip, went on to fulfill the ultimate ambition of the V2. They designed the engines that sent human beings into orbit and the Saturn V that carried them to the moon. But the price was never fully paid. The V2's legacy is forever bifurcated. One part is the shining, optimistic symbol of human endeavor reaching for the stars. The other is the dark, inescapable shadow of the 20,000 ghosts who died in the tunnels to build that dream. The V weapons teach a timeless lesson. Technology alone is a force multiplier, not a substitute for morality or strategy. When progress is made in the service of tyranny, the technology itself becomes a weapon of self-destruction. The future was twisted by the past, and humanity gained the moon at a cost measured not in currency, but in soul.